call the Shadow Minister.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The opposition won't be opposing this legislation, but I do want to use this second reading opportunity to make a few points. The government's abolition of AusAID means that certain pieces of legislation need to be updated to substitute references to AusAID with references to DFAT. This legislation is simply an effort to ensure that employees of Australia's civilian corps are properly employed. This bill transfers their Commonwealth engagement from the abolished AusAID to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. The Australian Civilian Corps was the Labor initiative of the last Parliament. We want to ensure that the Australian Civilian Corps operates under the certainty it needs, so we won't oppose this legislation. The ACC is a group of experienced civilian specialists who provide stabilisation and recovery assistance to fragile states and countries experiencing or emerging from conflict or natural disaster. The ACC was formed in 2011 and is designed to provide a flexible and timely Australian response that bridges the gap between humanitarian and emergency relief and long-term development programs. The ACC is well established with more than 489 registered specialists as at October 2013. With extensive field experience and deep subject matter expertise across 14 specialty areas, such as electoral assistance, health and financial management, engineering and the law. Recently, ACC specialists have assisted with the 2013 PNG elections and recovery in Samoa this year, following Cyclone Evan. The ACC is a worthy and successful Labor initiative. While the opposition opposes the government's $4.5 billion of cuts to Australia's foreign aid budget and has deep concerns about what this will mean for the loss of specialist experience in the delivery of foreign aid, these amendments are merely seeking to ensure the ACC is now operating under the direction of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Aid. Have I got to the next piece of legislation without finishing the last one? Is that what you're doing? No? Okay. So, as I said, we won't be opposing the legislation, but I do want to say a few words about why this legislation is necessary. Of course, the legislation wouldn't be necessary if the government hadn't abolished AusAID. The integration of AusAID into the Department of Foreign Affairs was executed suddenly and very poorly. Staff are going into this Christmas period with no certainty about their future. And we don't know just how much expertise in international development policy is going to be lost as a result of AusAID's abolition. We've seen, of course, the reports about how next year's graduate program has been scrapped after 2 or 3 dozen new graduates were given employment offers, and which the Senate estimates heard a fortnight ago could leave the government open to legal action. It also means that we lose a generation of the best and brightest, idealistic young women and men who would have performed outstandingly academically and chosen a career in overseas development as a way of representing their country and contributing to the world. The way the merger's been carried out, coupled with the huge $4.5 billion cuts to the aid program, raise very serious questions about how Australia's international development program will continue to be delivered. What will be the impact on the delivery of foreign aid when a specialist international development agency is subsumed into the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade? The government has been saying that the abolition of AusAID is because they want to see a better alignment between our aid program and our trade program and our diplomatic program. In fact, I would be delighted if anyone could point to one example of where our aid program and diplomatic program and trade programs were in conflict This is an absolutely spurious argument for the abolition of AusAID. In fact, the Prime Minister has even said, I hear the member at the table commenting about the Security Council bid, which of course the now government initially opposed and has now been happy to be part of. The Prime Minister has said that he, and I quote, doesn't want our diplomacy going in one direction and our aid program going in another direction. Again, I would say to the government, if they could point to a single instance where aid and diplomacy have been in conflict, I would like to see it. As I said back in October, of course, Labor in government considers issues such as our responsibility to our near neighbours being more acute and demanding than the member opposite. Would you acknowledge the interjection so that it's on the record? The criticism is of establishing new missions in Africa. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Would you take a question?
On the intervention?
The payment for the statue of over $150,000 in New York.
No, the member opposite spoke about Africa.
Just before
Exactly.
Order. Do you accept the intervention?
I do. I'd like to hear what he's got to say about Africa.
Could you please explain Australia's interest in paying $150,000 for a statue at the UN?
Concerning the end of slavery.
The member opposite is critical of our relationship with Africa now. Thank you. Sit down. Sit down.
Order. You've had your intervention.
Sit down. I'd like to see, as I said back in October, that our relationship and our responsibility to our near neighbours, of course, is more acute and demanding than our responsibility to more distant friends. But our aid policy already reflected that. The aid versus diplomacy is a false dichotomy. Aid versus trade, an equally false dichotomy. Helping our neighbours develop strong economies means better markets for our goods. Helping our neighbours improve their health systems means fewer health threats, like the development that we've seen of multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis and indeed malaria on our doorstep. Increasing the number of children in our region going to school reduces the opportunity for indoctrination in place of education. The success of our neighbours is good for us. The danger of losing AusAID, of course, is the danger of losing dedicated staff with specialist expertise and contacts in developing countries. Bloated the aid budget, he says, a $4.5 billion cut to the aid budget, which will hurt the most vulnerable members of communities in our region and around the world, is the bloated aid budget, according to the member opposite. Today I want to reiterate the opposition's commitment to international development. As I said, this legislation is only necessary because the government has abolished AusAID, so it's important to reiterate our aims for international development. We have two goals for the quantum of our international development effort. The first is to increase our overseas development assistance to 0.5% of GNI, and beyond that, we believe in working towards a target of 0.7% of GNI. Under the previous Labor government, Australia's contribution to overseas development assistance grew with every budget. In 2006-07, no, sit down.
I'm not asking you. I'm asking the Speaker. Am I entitled?
You can ask whether the Shadow Minister will receive the intervention.
Would you answer a question about the aid budget?
No, sit down.
Why won't you answer?
No, that's enough.
The aid budget?
The member for Kooyong is not assisting the debate. He can take his place.
$4.5 billion cut, and he wants to justify it in this place. What nonsense. Under the previous Labor government, our contribution to overseas development assistance grew with every budget. In 2006-07, we gave $2.9 billion through AusAID, and by 2013-14 that had grown to $5.66 billion. During our time in government, we almost doubled overseas development assistance. And now we find that our proportion of aid to GNI is back to 2000-2001 levels under this government. As I said at the end of October in a speech to the Australian Council for International Development, the government's decision to slash $4.5 billion from Australia's aid budget, announced at a minute to midnight in the dying days of the election campaign, is a severe disappointment to millions of Australians who agree that we have an ethical responsibility to help, and it's a betrayal of the poorest of the poor in our region and around the globe. And we are committed to holding this government to account. In Washington DC, right now, governments from around the world will be asked to make commitments to replenish the Global Fund, which fights HIV, tuberculosis and malaria in the developing world. Australia is already strongly engaged in the Global Fund. I met with Global Fund Director Mark Dybel recently to hear of their work, and he expressed his gratitude for Australia's past efforts and the Global Fund's desire for an ongoing commitment from Australia. Since 2002, the fund has approved programs worth more than US $22.4 billion in 150 countries and has saved an estimated 8.7 million lives by providing antiretroviral treatment for people living with HIV, provided tuberculosis treatment for 9.7 million people. The fund supports the strengthening of health systems, invests in training and aims to improve service delivery in hard-to-reach places and at-risk populations. With Australia's help, the Global Fund has done some amazing work in the Asia-Pacific region. Around 21% of the Global Fund's grants are directed to Asia and the Pacific. These grants have resulted in more than 500,000 people on life-saving HIV treatment, 46 million insecticide-treated bed nets distributed, and the treatment of 6.6 million cases of tuberculosis. Other results in Asia and the Pacific include, over the past 10 years, Cambodia has documented important declines in TB prevalence, incidence and mortality. Preliminary surveys found a 43% decline in the prevalence of TB cases between 2002 and 2011, an average decline of 4.7% per year. In Papua New Guinea, malaria prevention has also been strong, with 3.6 million insecticide-treated nets distributed. In Timor-Leste, over 3,500 people received HIV testing and counselling in 2011, and over 450,000 condoms were distributed to prevent the spread of HIV. In Indonesia, 23,000 people currently receiving HIV treatment, and the Global Fund finances 50% of the national HIV program. Labor's last budget confirmed Australia's payment of $100 million this year, the largest single-year contribution ever made by Australia. Over the last term of the government, Labor contributed over $200 million. Over the 4 years, from 2013 to 16, the Global Fund aims to save a further 10 million lives and prevent up to 180 million new infections from these 3 diseases. And this work is work that Australia must make a contribution to. Australia is being called on to contribute $375 million to the Global Fund for the years 2014 to 16. Remembering that in our last year of funding, Australia has contributed a historic high $100 million, what has the government announced today? They have announced a cut to our funding for the Global Fund, a cut to around $67 million for the next year, and the year after that, and the year after that, from $100 million this year to $200 million over the next 3 years, well short of the $375 million expected by the Global Fund, by the international community, by non-government organisations in Australia, and most importantly, by citizens around our region who are relying on Australia's contribution to the Global Fund. The opposition, as I said, won't oppose this legislation, but we bear in mind why this legislation is necessary. The government has abolished AusAID. They've made significant cuts to our aid program, and they're in the process of making significant changes to how our international development policy is delivered. Serious questions are raised, and we are yet to see adequate explanations from the government. Remembering that the Global Fund has been successful in our region, it's been successful internationally, to see the $375 million expected of Australia become instead $200 million, just over half of what was expected, to see the $100 million that we've contributed this year become a paltry $67 million next year, at a time when need around the world is as great as it has ever been, and at a time when the Global Fund says if we don't continue to invest now, we will pay forever. Because if we see backsliding now, if we see a reduction in effort today on tuberculosis or malaria or HIV, we will never catch up again. When it comes to the development of multi-drug resistant strains of tuberculosis, the threat is on our doorstep right now, and this cheap jack cut price effort with the Global Fund is something that we will pay for and our neighbours will pay for generations to come.